All right, welcome to the deep dive, everybody. We're back and ready, as always, to cut through all the noise and really get to the heart of what matters and to do it fast. You know the deal. We're going to take those massive piles of information that you're facing every day and try to pull out those crucial insights.
Exactly. And the source you guys chose for today, well, it's a classic, really. Ogilvy on Advertising.
By David Ogilvy.
Right. Published way back in 1983.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing to think about, a book written decades ago, packed with wisdom that honestly is still incredibly relevant even today.
It's remarkable, isn't it? And this isn't just some theoretical textbook or a dry academic paper. This is a legend. This is David Ogilvy, one of the true giants of the advertising world, sharing his hard-won, real-world experiences and observations about what actually works, what actually makes people decide to buy something.
And often his observations are actually pretty surprising.
Yeah, and that's what makes this book so interesting. So for this deep dive, our mission is to extract those timeless, truly timeless principles, the actionable advice, and those aha moments that are going to give you a deep understanding of what makes advertising truly effective.
Without overwhelming you with jargon, of course.
That's the key. We're going to keep it clear, concise, and get you up to speed quickly. All right, let's dive right in. One of the things that Ogilvy makes very clear right from the start, and it's surprising how relevant this remains today, is that so many of the advertising techniques that were effective when he first wrote Confessions of an Advertising Man are still powerful today. I mean, we're talking about techniques that were working decades ago.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, why do you think that is? Why do you think those techniques are still so effective after all these years?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they're rooted in those fundamental human motivations and desires that haven't really changed all that much.
Yeah, exactly. Ogilvy actually breaks down the core motivations that advertising tends to tap into.
Mm-hmm.
He argues that consistently, people are drawn to products that offer them value for their money, right?
Makes sense.
Of course.
Great.
Things that enhance their appearance, so beauty products.
Yeah.
Things that improve their health, nutrition, all that.
Right.
Things that offer relief from suffering, whether that's physical pain or emotional distress.
Yeah.
And, of course, things that elevate their social standing, status symbols.
Yeah, those desires, they're pretty deeply ingrained in us, aren't they? It seems like they haven't fundamentally changed all that much over time, even with all the advancements in technology and everything else.
You're right. And the key takeaway here for you, our listener, is to think about these core needs whenever you're trying to connect with an audience, no matter what you're communicating.
That's a really great point.
Whether it's advertising a product, selling a service, or just trying to get your ideas across in a presentation or meeting, these fundamental motivations are always going to be at play.
And Ogilvy really brings this to life with some incredible examples. Who can forget Doyle Dane Bernbach's classic campaign for Avis? When you're only number 2, you try harder. Or else. Talk about a clever way to position yourself against the market leader. Hurts.
Brilliant campaign. And what was so smart about it is they took what most would consider a weakness, being number 2, and turned it into a strength, right? They implied that because they were number 2, they had to work harder to please their customers. They had to offer better service.
Yeah, right.
And it resonated so strongly with people.
It really did. And then there was their equally brilliant campaign for Volkswagen, where they took this little car, the Beetle, and positioned it as a counterculture icon. This was in the era of those huge American cars from Detroit, and here comes this quirky little Beetle that honestly looked a bit odd at the time.
Yeah, and they made it cool. Julian Koenig's copywriting paired with Helmut Krone's art direction was just brilliant. They made the Beetle a symbol for people who were a little bit different,
Oh. Yeah, the nonconformists. The people who didn't want to follow the crowd.
Exactly.
It was a huge success.
Huge.
It really shows how understanding the cultural landscape, the mood of the times, and tapping into those deeper sentiments can be incredibly powerful when you're crafting your message.
Absolutely. And Ogilvy, he had this great way of describing advertising. He called it a radar sweep.
Radar sweep. What does he mean by that?
Well, he's saying that advertising is this ongoing process, constantly scanning the environment, looking for new potential customers entering the market, and people who are just reaching the point where they're ready to buy a particular product or service.
That's a great analogy. So it's not just about reaching the people who are already in the market, it's about anticipating the next wave, the next generation of customers.
Precisely. It's not a one-time effort, it's an ongoing process.
And it's not about just running the same ads forever without thinking, is it? I mean, there's that great story Ogilvy tells about Henry Ford asking a copywriter if a particular campaign needed to run indefinitely, and the copywriter's response is fantastic. He said, "It hasn't even started working yet."
It's a great story. Yeah. And it highlights something so crucial for anyone in marketing or advertising, or really any field where you're trying to communicate and persuade.
Which is?
Measurement.
Yeah.
You have to track your results. You have to know how well your advertising is actually performing.
Don't just assume it's working. Know for sure.
Exactly. And if the data shows that it's effective, then keep running it. But don't just blindly continue a campaign without knowing if it's actually moving the needle.
So true. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how advertising campaigns actually get made. Ogilvy was pretty outspoken about his dislike for creating ads by committee. You know, that whole death by 1,000 cuts scenario.
Yeah, he really felt strongly about that. He believed that the creative process, at its heart, should be driven by a strong individual vision.
Not a bunch of people in a room trying to water everything down to the lowest common denominator.
Precisely. He felt that too many cooks in the kitchen often led to uninspired, bland work.
And he also had this observation that many copywriters, even talented ones, just didn't aim high enough.
Yeah, he was always pushing people to raise your sights, to strive for work that was truly impactful and memorable.
He even quotes Leo Burnett, another advertising legend. Burnett said, "When you reach for the stars, you may not quite get one, but you won't come up with a handful of mud either."
Love that quote. And I think it speaks to the importance of ambition in any creative endeavor, really.
It really does. Whether you're writing an ad, designing a product, or building a company, set your sights high and don't be afraid to go for it.
Absolutely. And speaking of bold ideas, Ogilvy placed a huge emphasis on the importance of knowledge and research.
Yeah, he had this famous analogy where he compared a great advertising person to a great surgeon. He said a great surgeon knows more than other surgeons.
That's a really powerful comparison. It really highlights the importance of having a deep understanding of your craft.
Yeah. Just as a surgeon needs a profound understanding of anatomy, physiology, and surgical techniques, Ogilvy believed that advertising professionals need a deep understanding of their field, their clients, and most importantly, their customers.
He really stressed the importance of being a student of advertising,
Yeah.
reading books, studying successful campaigns, understanding consumer psychology.
And he wasn't afraid to call people out on it either. He tells the story about a copywriter who refused to read any books on advertising, just relying on pure intuition. And Ogilvy's response was classic. He compared it to having gallbladder surgery performed by someone who'd never studied medicine.
Ouch.
I know, right? But it makes a point, doesn't it? You wouldn't trust your health to an uninformed surgeon, so why would you trust your advertising budget, which can often be millions of dollars, to someone who doesn't have a solid grounding in the fundamentals?
A good point. And it's not just about the fundamentals either. Ogilvy was a huge proponent of research, especially testing and measuring the effectiveness of advertising campaigns.
He was actually quite surprised by how little rigorous analysis of test results was happening in the industry. I mean, companies were spending millions on testing, but he felt that not enough people were really digging into the data to understand what was consistently working and what wasn't.
It's interesting because you would think that in a field as data-driven as advertising, there would be this constant obsession with analyzing results. But as Ogilvy observed, that wasn't always the case.
Yeah. And he saw that as a huge missed opportunity for the industry to learn and improve. I mean, imagine if medical researchers just conducted clinical trials but never really analyzed the data to see what treatments were most effective.
Yeah, that would be crazy. And thankfully, in the medical field, they do analyze the data very carefully. But in advertising, at least in Ogilvy's time, there was this tendency to just move on to the next campaign without really taking the time to understand what had worked and what hadn't.
Right. But he did highlight some fantastic examples where research was used brilliantly, like Vaughn Flannery at Young and Rubicam, who used Gallup's readership research to significantly increase the number of people who were actually reading their clients' ads. I mean, that's a tangible result.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about that is that it wasn't about some radical creative breakthrough. It was about understanding how people were actually consuming media and then adjusting their approach accordingly.
So using data to inform your creative decisions, not just relying on your gut feeling.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just about general readership either. Ogilvy talked about Mill Shepherd's research from McCall's magazine. You know, the kind of stuff that seems really granular but can actually make a big difference.
What kind of stuff?
Well, things like whether a photo accompanying a recipe should show the finished dish or just the raw ingredients. It turned out that people were much more engaged when they could see the finished product.
It makes sense, right? You want to see what you're actually going to end up with.
Yeah. And even something as simple as providing recipes on cards, separate from the magazine itself, made a difference. It made it easier for people to actually use the recipes.
It's those little details that can make a huge difference.
It really is. And it shows how important it is to understand even the seemingly small things about your audience and how they consume information.
Now let's talk about something that Ogilvy was pretty passionate about. His critique of what he called the cult of creativity in advertising.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, you think creativity would be the lifeblood of advertising, right? But Ogilvy had a very specific perspective on it.
Yeah, he wasn't against creativity, not at all, but he was very clear that it should never be the sole goal of advertising.
He had this great quote from Benton Bowles: "If it doesn't sell, it isn't creative."
So true. I mean, at the end of the day, advertising has a job to do. It has to persuade people to buy a product or service.
And if it doesn't do that, then all the creativity in the world won't matter.
Precisely. And he even quotes Rosser Reeves, another advertising giant, who said, "Originality is the most dangerous word in advertising."
Originality, dangerous. Why would he say that?
Well, Reeves felt that too much emphasis on originality could lead to advertising that was clever and unique, but ultimately ineffective.
So it's not about being different for the sake of being different. It's about being effective.
Exactly.
And Ogilvy himself said that he used the word creative almost as a default because he couldn't think of a better term. But for him, it really boiled down to the hard work and the process of developing a big idea that would actually drive sales.
Yeah, it's about solving a problem for the client, and that often involves a lot of research, analysis, and strategic thinking, not just coming up with a flashy slogan or a funny jingle.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to an area that's becoming increasingly important in today's world: how advertising needs to be mindful of cultural sensitivities. I mean, what might be considered acceptable in one culture could be completely offensive in another. And Ogilvy gives some great examples of how what's considered taboo in advertising can change over time. Like when it became acceptable to feature women in cigarette and liquor ads.
Yeah, those were pretty controversial back in the day.
I can imagine. But even within a particular time period, what's considered appropriate can vary wildly from culture to culture. I mean, Ogilvy mentions this rather cheeky poster campaign in Paris that featured a woman in a bikini, and each day the poster promised to reveal a little bit more.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. Pretty risque, even for Paris.
Definitely. And Ogilvy pointed out that while Parisians might not have been particularly shocked, that kind of approach would likely backfire in a more conservative market.
Yeah, for sure. And he gives some other interesting examples, like how in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, there were strict regulations about showing women in advertising, and even a seemingly innocent soft drink commercial that featured a little girl licking her lips was banned in Saudi Arabia for being considered too suggestive.
Wow, I mean, that really highlights the need for cultural sensitivity in advertising.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it's not just about avoiding offense. It's also about understanding the nuances of different cultures and how to tailor your message in a way that will resonate with your target audience.
Absolutely.
All right, let's talk about the unsung heroes of the advertising world, the account executives.
Right, the people who bridge the gap between the agency and the client.
Exactly. And Ogilvy, he actually includes this dismal dialogue in the book that really illustrates how unclear the role of an account executive can sometimes be.
It's funny, but it also kind of makes you wonder, what do account executives actually do?
Right. And Ogilvy, he gives some great advice for anyone who's considering a career as an account executive, or really anyone who's in a client-facing role in any field.
What's his advice?
Become the most knowledgeable person in your organization about your client's business.
Mm-hmm.
He even tells this story about how when he got the Shell account, he went and studied oil geology and even visited refineries.
Wow, he really went deep.
He did. And he felt that this deep understanding allowed him to be a true partner to his clients, not just someone who was relaying information back and forth.
Right, he wanted to be able to offer insights and contribute to their success in a meaningful way.
Exactly. And he made this distinction between what he called custodian account executives, who were just kind of caretakers of the account, and contributor account executives, who are actively involved in developing strategies and generating ideas.
And I'm guessing he preferred the contributor type.
Oh, yeah, for sure. He believed that the best account executives were the ones who could really add value to the client relationship, not just manage the process.
So for our listeners out there who are working with clients, or even if you're just working with colleagues on a project, think about how you can be a contributor rather than just a custodian.
Great point. Now, Ogilvy also touched on something that's often overlooked in the business world, the speed of research. He contrasted the often slow, bureaucratic pace of research and advertising with the incredibly rapid turnaround that Gallup was able to achieve.
Yeah, Gallup, the polling organization, they're known for being able to get results very quickly.
Exactly. And Ogilvy had this experience where Gallup was conducting a poll for President Eisenhower, and they were able to get the results back to him in a matter of hours. And he contrasted that with how long it often took to get research results in advertising.
And I'm guessing he wasn't too happy about the slow pace.
Not at all. He believed that research needed to be timely to be truly valuable. You know, if you're getting information months after you need it, what good is it?
Right. It's like getting a weather forecast after the storm has already passed.
Precisely. And he even pushed his own team at Gallup's Audience Research Institute to deliver reports in days, not weeks or months, because he knew that time was of the essence.
So for our listeners out there who are involved in any kind of research or data analysis, think about how you can speed up the process without sacrificing accuracy, of course.
Make the information actionable as quickly as possible.
Now, let's talk about what qualities Ogilvy believed made someone successful in advertising. I mean, he had a whole list, but he put one quality right at the top.
And that was
Good psychologist.
interesting. You know, you don't often hear that associated with advertising.
I know, right? But it makes perfect sense when you think about it.
Of course. Advertising, at its core, is about understanding people, what motivates them, what their fears and aspirations are, what makes them tick.
And to be truly effective, you need to have a deep understanding of human psychology. You need to be able to get inside the heads of your target audience and figure out what's going to resonate with them.
And Ogilvy wasn't just talking about the people who were creating the ads either. He also talked about the importance of understanding the psychology of the client.
Yeah, because managing client relationships is a huge part of the advertising business.
Absolutely. And he even mentioned Albert Lasker's experience managing copywriters, saying that it wasn't always easy and often required a lot of patience and understanding.
So it sounds like managing creative talent is an art form in itself.
Yeah. And it requires a deep understanding of people's strengths, weaknesses, and motivations.
Now, Ogilvy also shares some pretty interesting personal anecdotes in the book, like how Reader's Digest actually paid his old school for an ad that he had written for them, and Omega paid him a substantial fee just for his advice on a marketing campaign.
It really shows the level of respect and recognition he had in the industry. I mean, people were literally paying him just to pick his brain.
Yeah, he was a sought-after consultant. Even Campbell Soup brought him in to advise them on their marketing strategy.
And there's that great story about how Curtis Publishing compensated him with antique lamps for writing an ad, partly to navigate some internal politics within the company.
He definitely understood how to play the game, didn't he?
He did. And he had this amazing ability to balance his creative vision with the realities of the business world.
Now, let's move on to the topic of running an advertising agency. Ogilvy doesn't sugarcoat it at all. He talks about the long hours, the constant pressure to win new business, and the challenges of maintaining morale in a profession that's often filled with anxiety and uncertainty.
And he was remarkably honest about his own experiences, like how he always felt a sense of dread before writing an ad, even after all his success.
I guess even the legends feel the pressure.
They do.
Yeah.
And he also talked about the potential pitfalls of promoting highly talented creative people into management roles. You know, how sometimes they're much more effective when they're actually creating the work rather than managing others.
Right. Sometimes the best creatives aren't always the best managers.
Exactly. And he gives this great example of George Cecil, who wrote the advertising for American Telephone for 40 years, but probably wouldn't have been as successful in the management role.
And then there's his analogy about hiring, which he compares to those Russian nesting dolls, the Matryoshka dolls. He said you should always try to hire people who are more talented than you are. Otherwise, you'll end up with a company full of people who are less capable than you.
A great analogy. And he even admitted that he had failed to recruit some truly exceptional talent over the years, like Helmut Krohn, the art director who did those amazing Volkswagen
And
ads.
Shirley Polikoff, the copywriter behind those classic Clairol campaigns. Does she or doesn't she?
It just goes to show that even the best sometimes miss out on incredible talent.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about leadership, because Ogilvy had some really interesting observations about what makes a great leader. He had the opportunity to work with some truly remarkable people throughout his career, and he felt that many corporate managers, even successful ones, lacked those true leadership qualities.
And what were some of the qualities he looked for in a leader?
Well, he emphasized self-confidence, of course.
Yeah, that seems essential.
And he also talked about the importance of not being petty, not getting caught up in the small stuff.
Right, being able to see the bigger picture.
Exactly. And he also talked about resilience, the ability to bounce back from setbacks, and commitment, the willingness to go the extra mile and see things through.
And perhaps most importantly, he talked about the courage to make tough decisions, even unpopular ones.
And he had this great quote from Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, about how a great leader needs to be a good butcher.
That's a pretty vivid image.
It is, but it really drives home the point that leadership sometimes requires making difficult choices that might not please everyone.
Yeah. And he also talked about this visceral form of spiritual energy that he observed in certain leaders. People like Marvin Bower, who built McKinsey and Company into a global consulting powerhouse, and Ted Moscoso, who spearheaded the economic transformation of Puerto Rico.
These were people who had this incredible drive and passion that seemed to inspire everyone around them.
And he also emphasized the importance of understanding the psychology of the people you're leading. And he noted some interesting differences between American and European leadership styles.
Now, Ogilvy also placed a lot of value on having clearly defined written principles. He told this story about how he had drafted a set of principles for his agency, and he had initially prioritized profit over client service.
And I'm guessing Marvin Bower wasn't too happy about that.
Not at all. Bower was a strong advocate for putting the client first, and he made it very clear to Ogilvy that profit should be a consequence of delivering exceptional service, not the primary goal.
A valuable lesson for any business, really.
Absolutely.
Now, let's talk about the age-old question for any business. How do you attract new clients? Ogilvy, with his characteristic confidence, talked about his own success in winning new accounts. And he even shared the list of prestigious clients that he had initially targeted when he started his agency.
And he actually managed to land most of them, didn't he?
He did. And what's interesting is that his primary strategy for getting new clients was simply to do great work.
That's the best advertising, isn't it?
It really is. He believed that the best way to attract new clients was to have a portfolio of successful campaigns that spoke for themselves. And he even had companies like IBM approach him directly because they were so impressed with his work.
It's the power of reputation.
Absolutely. But he also shared a story about a time when he let his pride get in the way and turned down a potential client, Anton Rippert of Rothman Cigarettes.
And he later regretted that decision, didn't he?
It did. It's a good reminder that even the best of us can make mistakes, and that sometimes it's important to swallow your pride and take advantage of opportunities when they present themselves.
Especially when it comes to business.
Right. And he also had some pretty strong opinions about the often lengthy and tedious process of agency selection. Those long questionnaires and presentations that can drag on for weeks or even months.
Yeah, those can be pretty painful.
He advised clients not to get too bogged down in all that and to focus more on the actual work that the agency was presenting. And he also suggested that they shouldn't make their decision solely based on price.
Right, because the cheapest option isn't always the best.
Exactly. He believed that clients should choose an agency based on their ability to create effective advertising, not just on how much they were charging.
And he also had some advice for agencies who were pitching new business. He felt that they should be honest and upfront about their weaknesses.
It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Yeah, but he felt that it actually built trust with the client. Acknowledging that you're not perfect, but that you're committed to doing your best for them.
It's like saying, look, we're not going to pretend that we're something we're not, but we're confident that we can deliver the results you need.
Precisely.
And he also advised agencies to avoid getting too bogged down in their past successes. Not spending too much time showing off all their awards and case studies.
Right, because ultimately the client is more interested in what you can do for them in the future, not what you've done for others in the past.
Exactly. And he also stressed the importance of a thoughtful follow-up after a pitch.
Yeah, because even if you don't win the business right away, staying top of mind can pay off down the road.
Absolutely. Now, Ogilvy also had some interesting thoughts about the size of advertising agencies. He noted that smaller agencies often face challenges in competing for large accounts because they simply didn't have the resources or the manpower to handle those big, complex campaigns.
And he also pointed out that there's a potential risk in growing too large too quickly. That sometimes when agencies get too big, they can lose that entrepreneurial spirit and become more bureaucratic and less creative.
So it's a balancing act, isn't it? You need to be big enough to handle the demands of your clients, but not so big that you lose your agility and your creative edge.
Exactly. And Ogilvy made this interesting observation about how many advertising agencies don't actually advertise their own services very well.
That seems kind of ironic, doesn't it? I mean, you would think that the people who are experts in persuasion would be masters of self-promotion.
You would think. But, as Ogilvy observed, many agencies just weren't very good at marketing themselves.
And he suggested that agencies need to be very clear about what they're trying to achieve with their own advertising. Are they trying to build their reputation, generate leads, or something else entirely?
And he also recommended direct mail as a particularly effective medium for agencies to use.
Direct mail? I mean, that seems kind of old school in today's digital world.
It does. But as Ogilvy pointed out, direct mail can be very effective when it's done well. And he even cited Young and Rubikam's long-running campaign in Fortune magazine as an example.
So it's not about the medium, it's about the message.
Exactly. And Ogilvy also had this cautionary note about agency self-promotion. He felt that too often copywriters and art directors, when left to their own devices, would create ads that were more about impressing their peers than actually attracting clients.
So it's important to keep your target audience in mind, even when you're advertising your own agency.
Absolutely. And he even included an open letter to a client in search of an agency in the book, offering some very direct and practical advice.
Like what?
Well, he advised clients to personally oversee the agency selection process rather than delegating it to a committee, because ultimately the client is the one who has to live with the decision.
Right, and often the client is the one who has the best understanding of their own business and their target audience.
Exactly. And he also suggested that clients should simply flip through magazines and watch television to see what ads they liked, and then find out which agencies created them.
That's a pretty straightforward approach.
It is. And he also suggested that clients insist on a 5-year contract with the agency they choose.
5 years? That seems like a pretty long commitment.
It is. But he felt that it created a sense of stability and allowed both the client and the agency to really focus on building a long-term relationship.
Makes sense. And he also had this great line, clients get the advertising they deserve.
I love that line.
Me too. It really highlights the importance of the client-agency relationship.
And he used this fantastic analogy about how you shouldn't keep a dog and bark yourself.
Yeah.
If you're going to hire an expert, trust them to do their job.
Don't micromanage them.
Exactly. And he also advised clients to limit the number of people who had to approve the advertising.
Yeah, because the more people who get involved, the more diluted the message can become.
Right. And he also talked about the importance of treating copywriters with respect, because they're the ones who are coming up with the ideas. And if you don't give them the freedom to be creative, you're not going to get their best work.
So true.
And he shared this really inspiring example of a client, Ted Moscoso, who was the head of tourism for Puerto Rico. And he was incredibly collaborative and supportive of the agency.
So a dream client, basically.
Pretty much. And Ogilvy also addressed the common practice of agencies not working with competing clients.
Right. You wouldn't want to be working on campaigns for both Coke and Pepsi at the same time.
Exactly. And while he acknowledged that it could be a complex issue, he felt that it was important for agencies to avoid those potential conflicts of interest.
Now, let's delve into some of the specifics of print advertising. Ogilvy was a firm believer in the consistency of how consumers react to different elements of an ad, like headlines, for example.
He was a huge advocate for strong headlines, and he even said that something as simple as including the name of the local city in a newspaper headline could dramatically improve results.
Really?
Yeah. And he had this fascinating anecdote about how he had a psychologist conduct a word association test, and the word darling turned out to be very emotionally resonant. So he used that in a headline for a Dove Soap ad, and it was very successful.
So it's about understanding the psychology of language.
It is.
And he also cautioned against using tricky headlines that rely on double meanings or puns. Those headlines that make you think, wait, what does that even mean?
Yeah, because often those headlines just end up confusing people rather than engaging them.
Right. And he also stressed the importance of headlines that either offered news or promised a clear benefit to the reader.
Makes sense. You need to give people a reason to keep reading.
Exactly. And he also pointed out that historical subjects tend to bore most readers.
And he warned against assuming that your own personal interests are going to align with those of your target audience.
Yeah, just because you're fascinated by something doesn't mean that everyone else is.
And he used his own experience as an example. He had been a chef before he got into advertising, but he realized that most people weren't really interested in the finer points of French cuisine.
So he had to learn to put aside his own personal biases and focus on what would actually resonate with his target audience.
Exactly.
And he also highlighted the enduring power of before and after photographs.
Yeah, those are always a classic.
And he also talked about the effectiveness of testimonials, especially from credible experts.
Right, because people are more likely to believe someone who has the credentials and the experience to back up their claims.
And he was less enthusiastic about endorsements from celebrities.
Yeah, because people often assume that celebrities are just being paid to say nice things about a product.
It can come across as inauthentic.
Yeah, exactly. And he was a big proponent of including markdowns and special offers in advertising.
Makes sense. Everyone loves a deal.
And he always tried to include the price in his ads, even for luxury products. He used the analogy of a jewelry store, where they don't display the prices, and you feel kind of awkward asking how much something costs.
So he felt that being upfront about the price could actually make people more likely to buy.
Yeah, it creates a sense of transparency and trust. And he also believed very strongly that advertising agencies should sign their ads.
Like putting their name on.